In this week's video, I test and review two essential landscape filters from Polar Pro. I share camera settings for waterfall photography, plus I've got some cool Lightroom tips to share. Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. Welcome to my channel. Now in this video, I'm going to be talking about filters and I'm going to be reviewing these two filters from Polar Pro. Now I've had these for a few months. I've been using them and it's taken a bit of time to get this video together. That's mostly due to commitments, work and a bit of travel, but here we are at last. The first filter we're looking at is the Polar Pro Circular Polarizing Filter, which comes packed in a really stylish presentation box. Open up the box and inside we have a welcome pack that includes the warranty card, stickers and a small cleaning cloth. You also get a soft filter case plus a hard case containing the filter plus a second microfiber cloth to keep your filters clean. Overall, a really nicely presented product. Next up is the Polar Pro ND filter, which again comes in a stylish pack that includes an info card that contains details of the Polar Pro app, a sticker, another very nice microfiber cloth to clean the filter with, and a choice of soft case or alternatively a hard case to protect the filter. Now the circular polarizing filter is, if you're a landscape photographer, pretty much a must-have bit of kit. They are very, very popular. Now, regular viewers will know that on this channel, I don't like to bore people with the boring stuff. Wikipedia has got a really good page all about the science behind polarization and light and how it affects images. And I'll put a link in the description below the video because it's probably worth a read. But all we need to worry about for now is that reflections, glare, scattered light can cause your images to look a little bit washed out. But with a little bit of magic, aka a polarizing filter, we can filter out some of the unwanted light and greatly improve our images. Now a polarizing filter is actually two pieces of glass, and you'll find that when you attach this to the front of your lens, the outside piece of glass can be rotated. Now there's a reason for this. The polarization effect is largely based upon the position of the sun in relation to your camera. Having the sun at roughly 90 degrees to the front of the lens should give you the best results. But of course we can't always guarantee the position of the sun, so what you could do is rotate the front of the filter to give you the best results. Now when using a polarizing filter, you're going to notice an increase in the saturation of the colors in your image. This is very noticeable in the blues and the greens, which if you think about it are the dominant colors if you're a landscape photographer. You'll also notice that it will reduce glare, so if you're photographing water or glass or glossy surfaces, you will see a big improvement, and also haze and generally glare can be reduced. So there's lots of reasons to consider using a polarizing filter. Here you can clearly see how rotating the filter affects the glare and reflections on the rocks. So to use a polarizing filter really couldn't be easier. You just pop it on the front of your lens, you turn the outside piece of glass and the magic happens. Now to put this polarizing filter to the test, I got up extra early, 4 AM for sunrise, and I went to the Swell Sculpture Festival on the beautiful Gold Coast. Now some people will argue that you don't really need a polarizing filter these days with Lightroom and Photoshop, but to be fair, whilst you can boost colors and increase saturation using software, when it comes to reflections on surfaces like glass and water, you cannot replicate that in Photoshop. You cannot remove reflections in Photoshop in the same way that a good quality polarizing filter will. So far it's looking good for polarizing filters, but there are a couple of things you need to be made aware of, and that is, firstly, a polarizing filter is actually quite dark, so you do lose some light. With this particular polarizing filter, you lose 1.3 stops or 1 1/3 stops of light. Now, to compensate for this, you can slow your shutter speed down. Shake can then be an issue, so we can fix that by using, of course, a tripod. The next thing you want to be aware of is they aren't really suited to wide lenses. When you pop one of these on a wide lens, you may notice uneven colors in the sky. This is often referred to as banding. So there's a couple of things you need to be made aware of when using a polarizing filter. Now, if you are thinking about buying some filters, I've got a really good tip for you, and that is to go large. Now, what I mean by that is filters come in different sizes to fit different types of lenses. Now, my biggest lens is this. This is my 70 to 200mm Nikon, and this has a 77mm thread size on the front of the lens. So that means you need a 77mm filter to fit this lens. So these are 77mm filters. Now, of course, I've got plenty of other lenses that are smaller. So to suit those, you buy these step-in rings that allow you to step down so they fit. Now, it's a lot cheaper to buy step-in rings and use the one filter than buy multiple filters. So buy the filter that fits your biggest lens. Now, the next filter I want to talk about is the ND, or neutral density filter. Now, N meaning that the color of the filter or the color of the glass is not going to affect your picture in any way. It's completely neutral. Now, D stands for density, and that's because this filter is very, very dark. They have different numbers. This is an ND64, and the bigger the number, the denser or the darker the filter will be. So this can be used to reduce light. Now, this ND64 effectively drops the exposure by 6 stops. Now, don't worry if you don't know too much about what that means. It does mean that you're going to have to find some other way of getting more light in your camera, which typically will mean a slower shutter speed. So again, another good reason to purchase and use a tripod. So to put this ND filter to the test, I packed my bag. I also brought along the circular polarizing filter, and I went to a place called JC Slaughter Falls, which is at the base of Mount Coot-Tha. It's about a 40-minute drive from the office. So after months of dry weather, drought-like conditions and bushfires that have swept across Australia, here in Brisbane we finally got some rain. So this was the ideal opportunity to do some waterfall photography. Now, the plan was to shoot at a few different locations until sundown, and things started out great. This first image was shot with just the polarizing filter. The shutter speed here is 1/10 of a second. Adding the neutral density filter allowed me to slow the shutter down to 15 seconds, and I was really happy with this, my first shot of the afternoon. But the afternoon was about to take a turn. My Canon 80D took a tumble into the water, completely submerged. I guess now I get to find out if the weather sealing's any good on this camera. Of course, a weather sealed camera and a waterproof camera are two very different things. So after drying the 80D off the best I could, I packed up my gear and set off for the main falls. And then I came across this fella. Now, this was one of the biggest snakes I'd ever seen, and that's just the half of him we can see. The other half is hiding in the bushes. So I grabbed my camera bag and I was off once again. I eventually made it to JC Slaughter Falls and got a few more great shots, but decided to head back to the office early as I wanted to attend to the 80D. Now, whilst I did have a good trip and I got some great waterfall photos, I was absolutely gutted that my Canon 80D fell into the water. I'm very careful with my gear, I really am, but accidents happen, and as I grabbed it off the tripod, it simply slipped out my hand, fell into the water and was completely submerged for a good few seconds. So I pulled it out, I stripped it down, I got the battery out, which is incredibly important, and I shook off as much water as I could, and I popped it into the sun to dry while I packed up all my gear. As soon as I got back to the office, I put it in these the camera and the lens into these Ziploc bags with some rice, because I'm told that the rice will soak up the moisture. Here they've been for a couple of days now, and in a few moments I'm going to open these bags and see if the camera survived. We'll find out in a few moments. Let's get back to the filters. So with both the ND filter and polarizing filter on the front of the Nikon Z6, I was determined to go home with one nice photo of the falls. Now to make this picture really work, I needed to use a slow shutter speed to blur the motion of the water. But one of the problems I was having was I was trying to take a picture mid-afternoon in the middle of the summer in Brisbane. There was way too much light around. Now, the plan was to stay later into the day, but because I dropped my camera in the water just a few minutes prior, I wasn't going to be hanging around as long. Plus, considering the size of that snake I'd encountered earlier in the day, I didn't want to be there after dark. This is where the ND filter really starts to pay off. So with the polarizing filter on the front of the lens already, I was able to get down to 1/4 of a second shutter speed. And this was giving me a little bit of blur, but I craved more, wanted a lot of blur. Popping on the ND filter, I was able to slow the shutter down to 13 seconds. And the results, I think, were amazing. Now, once I got back to the office and I'd sorted out my Canon 80D, it was time to put the images into Lightroom. And this is where you really get to find out how good the images are. And I was blown away by the quality. They looked amazing. Sometimes when you use filters, it can have a detrimental effect on the quality of the image, particularly if you're using cheap filters. Now with these images, they were great. They were sharp from edge to edge. There was no vignetting. There was no noticeable color casts. The quality with both the ND and the polarizing filters were amazing. Now, I was shooting raw images using a Nikon Z6. I adjusted the image in Lightroom. I'm going to quickly walk you through that. It's often a surprise to people just how dull and flat a raw image can look straight out of camera, but after a couple of minutes in Lightroom, look at this, wow. So let me show you how it's done. Okay, so we're now into Lightroom. Firstly, moving over to the right-hand column, just under the histogram, you can see the camera settings that were used when we took the photo. And this image, in my view, does look quite dark. If you look at the histogram, you'll see everything's pushed over to the left, which means there's a lot of detail in the shadows, but not a lot in the highlights. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the exposure. So I'm dialing the exposure to the right, which means we can increase the overall exposure. And there you go. Now the picture is of course now much brighter and we've lifted the detail, but we now have got some overexposed areas, particularly in the water there. So going to go to the highlights and bring down the highlight slider, slide into the left, and this has reduced the highlights. Great thing about this is you can reduce the highlights but leave the shadows and the dark areas alone. So the next thing I'm going to do is I want to lift some of the shadow detail out. So I'm going to go to the shadow slider, dial to the right, which is the plus side, and this will just lift some of the detail in the shadow areas only. What's great about highlights and shadows is you can be very selective. I'm going to drop the whites a little bit again to give me a bit more detail in the white areas, particularly in the water. And with the blacks, I'm just going to drop the blacks a little bit here just to give the picture a little bit more punch and a little bit more contrast. Now typically when you do this type of edit, the image can look a bit flat, so I'm going to now increase the contrast again just to make the image look a bit more punchier, and I think already this image looks pretty awesome. Now to see how far we've come, a good tip is to press the backslash button and you can see your original starting point and your edit so far. So this is a great way of just keeping tabs on how far you've taken your edits so far. We don't want to overdo things. Okay, now we're going to look at white balance, because one thing I've noticed is that in the water here, the picture does look a little bit cool. It has a little bit of a blue tinge to it. So go into the white balance, sliding this over to the right, which is the plus side, and we can warm the image up. I think that looks a lot nicer. Okay, this looks great. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do some basic sharpening. So I'm going to go to texture, and I'm going to increase the texture. Now if I zoom in, you'll see this will add a bit more texture and detail to the rocks. I don't want to push this one too far, but I think that looks really nice. And next I'm going to go to the dehaze. Now if I drop the dehaze by dialing to the left, you'll see the image will really look very flat and looks awful. But if I increase it by dialing to the right just a touch, again I can just increase that clarity a little bit more, make the image a little bit more punchy. I think that looks really nice. Again, pressing the backslash button just to see my before and after, so I can keep an eye on how far I've taken the edit so far. Just going to wrap this up with some basic sharpening. Now I've got my sharpening set to 40. I'm going to increase it just a little bit, just to bring up the sharpness a tiny bit. Again, not wanting to overdo this. And another good tip for you actually is the masking slider. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the masking slider backwards and forwards while holding the option button on my Mac keyboard, and you will see this kind of black and white image appearing. Now the white areas are the areas in which the sharpening is applied. So I'm going to dial this to the right, because what I want to do is I only want to apply the sharpening to the rocks. I don't want it to apply to the water. So the water's black, and that means the image will only be sharpened in the white areas, which is where I want it. That's a really cool tip. And once again, there's our starting image and our edit. And I think this looks pretty awesome. That's a quick 4-minute edit in Lightroom. Now, as promised, in a moment, we're going to unwrap the Canon 80D and the lens and find out if it survived. I'm not actually feeling very hopeful. But before we do, let me give you my final thoughts on the Polar Pro filters. I have to say, without doubt, these are the best filters I personally have ever used. I already have an ND filter. I've already got a polarizing filter from other brands, but these blow them out of the water, not just in terms of the image quality, but also the build quality. Now, in all fairness, I have to say that these filters are not aimed at the cheaper end of the market. They are actually quite expensive, but like most things in life, you really do get what you pay for. And I think that's certainly true of these Polar Pro filters. The image quality is amazing and the build quality is amazing. These are filters that I'm going to use, I think, for a long time. And because the build quality is so good, I think they're going to last me a long time. So a big thank you to Polar Pro for giving me the opportunity to test out and review these filters. And look, a quick reminder, with my reviews, I give you my honest opinion. If I didn't like these, I would tell you. It's simple, and I do not get paid to review products on this channel. Okay, it's finally time to reveal if my Canon 80D and the lens has survived its fall into the water. So let me just move these over. I think first of all we're going to take a look at the lens. I'm going to go grab my glasses. Okay, so glasses on. So the reason I packed the lens and the camera into rice is because I'm told rice will soak up the moisture, and it was certainly worth a shot. And this lens actually doesn't look too bad. I'm not too worried about the lens though, because that's a fairly cheap item and it could be replaced. I'm more interested in the camera itself. The Canon 80D is a great camera, and it's actually the camera that I've recorded virtually all my YouTube videos on. So I'm really quite keen that it works. Just get a few bits of rice free. So let's move these out of the way. So I've got a battery. Now this isn't the battery that was in the camera when it fell in the water. I didn't think that was a good idea. So this is a separate and brand new battery. I'm going to pop that in. Not feeling very hopeful so far. Turn it on and absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. It's dead. Let's try it again. No. Okay, so it looks like the rice trick didn't work. This is now going to go to our local repair shop to get them to have a look at it. Hopefully it can be salvaged and hopefully it can be repaired. If not, then that's just the way it goes. Accidents do happen. But I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget you can leave your comments, suggestions or questions down below. You'll also find links for more details about these Polar Pro filters and also Lightroom trial as well if you want to check that out. I hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye. I'd like to give a shout out to our 4 winners who all guessed that this week's video would be about filters. Thank you to everyone who posted a guess. We had loads of entries. Make sure you follow Photogenius on Instagram. See you next time.